Good morning, folks. This is Christopher Dagger here at the Theology Department at Concordia University for another episode of the Off Bishop Street podcast. I'm accompanied at this moment by none other than Dr. Graham Dodds. Dr. Graham Dodds, how is it going this morning?
Going just fine, and happy to be here with you. Excuse me. Looking forward to this. Thanks.
Wonderful. So, Dr. Dodds, you're a professor in the political science department, and when I was looking through the Explore Concordia repertoire, I noticed a whole bunch of different names that have had different interesting, backgrounds, profiles, and interests, and the fact that your body of work relies heavily on American politics was very much of interest to me because, as a theology MA student doing my master's, I focus on eschatology, but I also look at the practical, concise implications that eschatology has on the political framework of America, right? So I think a nice place to start, Dr. Dodds, would be to see let's delve into bio and a little bit of educational background, even life background. That'd be very nice.
Sure, sure. I'm originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA, Philly. I'd lived in the U.S. Basically my entire life until I came here to Concordia for a job back in the fall of 2004, and I've been here ever since. God help me, I like this place, at least most days. And I'm now a dual citizen, and this is my home. But because I'm originally from the U.S. and I still have ties there, a lot of my teaching and a chunk of my research is about the former the politics of my former home and native land, which is to say, U.S. politics, American politics. So a lot of the courses I teach in political science here at Concordia are in some way related to American politics, and a good chunk of my research is relevant to that as well.
That's great. I mean, I've only started getting interested in American politics during my MA, right? And essentially, my supervisor, Dr. Andre Gagne, you might know him, has worked extensively on the ramifications of different religious thoughts on the political landscape, and not only for worse but also for better sometimes. And essentially, that's what I'm trying to delve into myself. Just writing the thesis and understanding what exactly is going on and how American dynamics are different from Canadian dynamics. I'm a kid from Toronto, and I grew up in Montreal my whole life, so I kind of had the chance and the opportunity to see the Anglophone Francophone divide here especially in Quebec, but especially when we look at the greater Canadian landscape. And I was just wondering, is there an analogy that can be made with the United States, or is it is it safe to say that the United States being mostly an Anglophone country, is there not necessarily a linguistic divide, but a cultural divide going on?
Wow, that's a big question. We're going to be here a long time if we delve into this in detail. I mean, look, the U.S. is a massive country. What the population of Canada could fit in California with room to spare. The population of Quebec is smaller than New York City. So the U.S. is just a massive place in terms of population, and any place that big will necessarily have a lot of divisions. That's just the way human beings work, in my experience. So, yeah, the U.S. is massively divided these days. People say it's quite divided politically, and this is something that I'm attuned to. But there are divides beyond that as well. There are, at least historically, religious divides, to be sure. I mean, as we record this, Pat Robertson recently died, and he was a central figure in the religious right in the, what should we say, late 20th century, and that had been a very big component of the Republican Party for decades. This may be changing, but I think it's a little bit different here in Canada. The U.S. certainly has racial divides, to be sure. I mean, my hometown of Philadelphia has been historically divided black and white, just as I think my adopted town of Montreal has historically been divided English and French. So, yeah, you have a nation of 330 million people, you're going to have some divides. There's no doubt about it.
I mean, yeah, and as much as the multicultural aspect of a particular geographic area is in and of itself a rich attribute for that country or city or province or state, it can also be a source of conflict, a lot of times. And historically, that there is a lot of backing historically to understand that, and you definitely know this far better than I do. But yeah, I was just wondering in your studies when you know first started university, you know, for doing your undergrad, I believe it was at Columbia,
Yep,
and
yep,
then you went to UC Irvine,
yep. Irvine,
and
yep,
you then did a PhD at UPenn,
yep.
UPenn, which is an Ivy League school, a great school,
Yeah, in my hometown of Philly.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, so, what were your initial intellectual interests?
Sure. Well, I remember even as an undergraduate being drawn to political science because it is an incredibly diverse field. To my mind, it is not just diverse, but fractious and fractured. And I like that. It is diverse intellectually, and it's just everything everywhere all the time. I mean, I tell my students it's the most diverse and fractious field, in my view, because emblematic of that, political scientists cannot even agree what to call our discipline. Is it political science? Is it political studies? Is it policy studies? Is it government? Different places call it different things, and those differences are emblematic of deeply held divisions in what it is we study and how we should be studying it. And even if you can agree that, well, we'll call it political science, all right, fine, how do you define politics and how do you define the scientific study of it? And people fight tooth and nail over this. And I think that's cool. I think that's fun. So I remember as an undergraduate thinking it was just incredibly diverse and everything was contested. And I continue to think that. And it can make life difficult at times. I mean, you know, if you're doing art history, there are differences, but you can at least agree what to call the discipline.
Right.
And we can't even get that far.
That's interesting, and you know, it's a muddy terrain when you look at it. At least for myself, as a layperson, from an external point of view, politics is definitely something that breeds a lot of conflict. But sometimes, you know, conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. So sometimes, you know, I compare to growing pains where you have to go through these different struggles with opposing viewpoints. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think political science is probably the best place to iron out these different contradictions.
Well, I don't know if we have any answers for ironing out differences or solving apparently intractable problems, but we can at least, I think, gain some insight onto the nature of the divisions and how they came to be and how they're evolving. I mean, at least in the US, where I'm from, better universities take the science part of political science very seriously. My own approach tends to be rather more historical in focus. I have this radical idea that my own approach is rather less doctrinaire and orthodox in terms of social science. I have this idea that to understand today, let alone make predictions about tomorrow, you need to know a little bit about yesterday, which is to say, I'm a very historically minded political scientist.
And yeah, so let's delve into that history. Let's delve into all these different moving parts. Um, how did you basically join together these different disciplines? How does history feed into political science, and what does history teach us when developing policies, when understanding politics, when you know navigating these waters?
Well, I mean, political science, again, being a diverse field, it has no sort of methodology of its own. You can approach the allegedly scientific study of politics, in quotes, a la any number of sister disciplines. You can do it a la philosophy, a la law, a la economics, a la anthropology, and the list goes on and on and on. My own view, which again is contested like everything else, but my own view is that history gives you more intellectual insight on more interesting questions than any other approach. And this is probably a minority view, at least in the United States, but that's the kind of political science I do. So, sort of the intersection of history, law, and politics. Now, a lot of my work, well, since I came here to Concordia when I was finishing up graduate school, a lot of my work is on unilateral powers of the American president, especially powers that are not provided for by the Constitution or by law, but rather have just sort of developed historically. So, this intersection of law, politics, and history has been a sort of a good vein for me to mine, as it were, and that's characterized a lot of my scholarship, at least as it relates to the American president.
Interesting. So yeah, so I mean, and that kind of echoes a little bit of what I was reading through, you know, last night, or was it this morning actually? When it comes to your bio, so focusing on that presidential seat, I think is super interesting because, you know, when we compare the president to the prime minister of Canada, we can see differences and resemblances and that kind of thing. And especially when we look at the United States and the different folks that have had that seat in the Oval Office, and knowing how much you know, for lack of a better word, power that they can exert, or the authority that they have over, probably the greatest nation on earth, and I'm saying that as a Canadian, is super interesting. Like, just to see these different personas, going all the way back to, Bill Clinton, George Bush, then you had Barack Obama, and now, I mean, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden. To see this plethora of different people come in and play their role and shape the country as it is to have what we have today in 2023. To me, it's fascinating because you see how different policies, different people, hate them or like them, have done obviously good and bad things. And I would say so for each and every one of them, just to not necessarily be right or left minded. And it's interesting. So, what would be your take on the presidency? Like, just looking at the plethora or the sequence of different presidents, um, what is it that you base? What would be your intellectual or even personal input on the matter?
Oh, well, this is also a big question. I mean, I teach all sorts of courses on this, but I mean, I, I think for many people, American politics and government kind of, in a facile way, could be reduced to the individual who occupies 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C., which is to say the White House, which is to say the president. And as I tell my students, the president matters. It matters a lot. It matters. I mean, who the president is matters to every single person and thing on the planet, whether we like it or not, whether fair or not, and it's not, but that's how it is. Nevertheless, American politics is more than just the person who happens to be president. As I tell my Canadian students, look, in the United States, Congress is separate and equal, no less important than the president. It doesn't often seem that way, but that's how it is. So there's a sense, as I tell my students, in which whoever the Prime Minister of Canada is, or she has more power than the president, because if there's a majority, well, Mr. Trudeau can do just about whatever he wants, and as Joe Biden would be the first to tell you, he unfortunately cannot do whatever he wants. So different systems, but yes, obviously the president matters. He or she someday is the symbolic head, if not the true head of the United States government, and what he or she wants carries a lot of weight. And the U.S. has an outsized role in the world, so it affects us all, whether we like it or not.
But would you be willing to believe that perhaps behind that particular individual, there would be a group of people, a council or committee or something, that the president must consult with before making any decisions? Like that he can't, or else we'd be living in a tyranny or a dictatorship, right?
Um, your fear is well founded because the answer to your question is no. The president doesn't have to rely or trust, go through anyone. The cabinet is a symbol, an empty symbol. If the president wakes up from a bad dream and pulls out a piece of paper and a pen, he or she can make an executive order that is binding and will change policy instantaneously, no matter what anyone else thinks, Congress, courts, or the American people notwithstanding. Um, so it matters who the president is. There are some accounts, people said that, well, with Donald Trump's, what should we say, mercurial presidency, people felt the cabinet could sort of make him act like a mature adult, and manifestly that did not work out. Indeed, there are stories from books by Bob Woodward and others that some of Trump's closest advisors tried to protect him from his own worst instincts by hiding documents to prevent him from doing what he wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that the American system has checks in place to guard against an unstable president? Sorry to say, there are not a lot of those checks. In fact, one of my own views is that after the Trump presidency, Congress could have and should have instituted a number of reforms to protect the republic from a future unstable, mercurial, anti-democratic president like Donald Trump. But it has not yet done so, and I don't think it will.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good take because it's the first time I hear that, and um, you know, because it's hard for me to, especially in the free world in the West and in developed societies where we're heavily against dictatorships that like the ones in, for instance, Russia, Syria, North Korea, and even to a certain extent the CCP in China. It's hard for me to to know that or acknowledge and accept that the president of the United States, or even the premier of Canada, if we look at Canada, could have such a level of power where they can literally override any decision making because why not give him the whole White House to himself and have him sit in the driver's seat and make all the decisions and work tenfold to run the country, right? So to me it sounds absurd, like to know that, and perhaps I'm having a hard time digesting it, but I don't know, like it's quite the weird reality. And
Yeah, I mean, not to sound alarmist, but I mean, there has been this sort of trend of democratic decline, democratic backsliding across numerous countries in the Western world over the last, what, 2 decades. And, certainly Trump is one prominent example, but he's not the only one. You can point to Brexit, you can point to things happening in, what, Poland, in Hungary, arguably in Israel. There's a long list of countries that have had similar threats, usually from chief executives who come from a sort of right wing or conservative populist background. Yeah, this is a tough time for democracy around the globe, and the U.S. Has been part of that. Sorry to say.
mhm. Well, yeah, so that's a very interesting point that you're bringing up here, the right wing aspect of different people, because I've never really picked a side when it comes politically. Like, do I lean left or do I lean right? Do I even need to lean left or right? So and I think I'm more of a pacifist by nature, just through my personality. And when there is something to be said, then I'll set my foot down and say it. But I've always, personally, from a political point of view, I think I consider myself more of a centrist because I don't want to lean right to the far right, and I don't want to lean left to the far left, right? And I do disagree with a lot on both ends. Perhaps I grew up in a more of a conservative home, so maybe I'm a little bit center right, just a little bit. And I could definitely understand the criticism of different right leaning presidents or politicians, but it can also definitely heavily criticize some more left leaning politicians. Like, for example, just to take a more contemporary example, Joe Biden. And I was really impressed by his speech that he gave a couple of months ago. I think it was right prior to coming to Canada, because he visited the Parliament a couple of weeks ago. But he gave a very interesting speech on how his administration was running, and it was a very powerful speech, and it seemed very genuine and truthful and authentic. But at the same time, there is a lot of justified criticism against Joe Biden, and I want to hear you about like Joe Biden's flaws,
Hmm.
because a
Hmm.
lot of them are coming out right now in the media.
Good. Good. I mean, I'll answer the question. I mean, first to your point about, if I may, sort of ideological positioning. There are these. I invite my students to do this, especially at the tuner level. There are these sort of things online where you can sort of figure out where you are ideologically if you haven't sort of come to terms with that yourself in your own mind. And there are a million of them if you just Google it. But they'll often ask you. A dozen, 20, 30 questions about policy issues. Do you agree with this? Do you agree with that? Everything from abortion, euthanasia to progressive taxation, et cetera, environmental protection. And after you answer these questions, they sort of put you on an ideological graph, and you can sort of see who's near you. Like, oh boy, here I am with Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, that kind of fits my own personal self identity. Or, oh, here I am with Margaret Thatcher. Who knew? So it's kind of fun. You can check that out, and maybe you're a closet conservative or a socialist and you weren't aware of it, and well, henceforth you'll know. I mean, but these labels are interesting, and in the U.S., right, left, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican are the big divides, but there are all sorts of other ones, of course. There's libertarianism, which can cut both ways. There's communitarianism, which can cut both ways. And these differences, I think, in the U.S. are magnified because it's a two-party system. There really are only two major political parties. This is an artifact of America's electoral laws, and that sort of two-partyism does tend to amplify what would otherwise be lots of differences that might get somehow lost in the mix. As for Biden, I mean, he's been sort of a centrist Democrat most of his life. The Democratic Party has moved to the left in recent decades a bit, and I think he's tracked that a bit. But he is someone who has angered the progressive wing of his party. He's someone who has tried with mixed success to get the conservative wing to go along. I have in mind chiefly Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. So I think he is more or less in the center of the party, such as it is. As he gears up for the reelection campaign a year hence, he doesn't generate a lot of enthusiasm among a lot of Democrats, especially people who would be more on the left, who identify more as liberal or progressive or whatever. But I think for them, the alternative, especially if it's Donald Trump, is just so horrifically unattractive that they'll vote with Biden, not holding their noses, but happily do so. And are there enough of those folks to make the difference? Well, we shall see.
That's pretty interesting. I mean, I was watching an interview. I didn't watch the whole thing, but I was watching an interview with Robert F. Kennedy. He got interviewed on a particularly prominent podcast a couple of days ago, to understand his thoughts, and I couldn't really grasp too much because I was short on time. But I heard, just from hearsay, I heard a lot of good things about him as a particular potential president. Now, obviously, there could be some bad things and some flaws that I'm not aware of. Is that a particular candidate that may be in the run?
Yeah, well, we'll find out soon enough. In the American system, just as in Canada, it's the party leaders who choose who the party's candidates will be. Well, in the US, it is the people who choose which politicians will represent the parties. So it's much more democratic in the US, but it's also rather chaotic. Donald Trump could not have emerged in 2016 under a Canadian type system where the party elites would choose their leader, but in the US, he was able to eventually emerge from a broad field, as he may yet again this next time around. RFK Jr. is an interesting fellow. For most of his life, he was sort of an environmental activist and more or less squarely, I think, within the Democratic camp that his clan, the Kennedys, have been significant in for decades and generations. But he's interesting to my mind because he is now sort of the representative in the Democratic fold of what has been very successful in the Republican fold, which I would call, oh, I don't want to be uncharitable, but populist, conspiracy, anti vax, flat earth extremism.
Interesting.
You can characterize it a little bit differently if you care to, but he has hitched his wagon to that. I don't know if he genuinely had a late, little middle life conversion to this, if he was persuaded by some of the anti-vax rhetoric during the pandemic. But that's the sort of thing he's associated with right now. And in the group of people who would vote for Republicans, that's a big constituency, for better or worse. In the group of people who vote for Democrats, I don't think that's a big constituency, but I could be wrong. There's a lot of people out there who do not trust the government, who think everything is going to hell in a handbasket, and they're ready to vote for sort of an anti-establishment candidate. So yeah, he might have some traction.
I mean, there's definitely a big wave when it comes to, overturning the establishment. I think it's an echo of what happened back in 2016 with 8 years under Obama, the Obama administration, and perhaps I think it's going to be a pendulum swing on both ends until time expires and the world ends, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek type of reference to my topic of eschatology. But then again, I'm not going to delve into that right away. Which I should actually we will delve into that pretty soon because I'd like to know like the parallels that exist between political science and theology. But yeah, like I mean, just to comment on what you just mentioned, the fact that there are so many folks in the United States that are anti-establishment, some with good reason, is very interesting. I wouldn't call it alarming, but I would say interesting. The slippery slope down the slide of delving into conspiracy theories and all these different sources of misinformation. And I think misinformation comes from actually both the far right and the far left. That's my personal stand on that. Is very interesting. But now that I just mentioned it, since we're in the theology department, it's in your studies or in your basically the academic career, were there points where you saw politics and religion touch and intertwine, and especially with for example, how religion or Christianity is used, or not necessarily used, but practiced and manifested in the United States?
Sure, sure. I alluded earlier to the recent passing of the Reverend Pat Robertson, and he is, to my mind, an exemplar of this broad phenomenon in the late 20th century of what should we say, evangelicals, conservative Christians, of getting into politics. And this is, I think, a fascinating development. And the story that's usually told is after the Scopes monkey trial, in which religious true believers were held up to ridicule, even though they won the case. They removed themselves from American life and created their own life, their own institutions at the periphery of American life until Roe v. Wade legalized, constitutionalized the right to abortion. And the conservative evangelical community said, oh my, we were wrong to get out of politics. The country desperately needs us. And they got back in big time and helped get Ronald Reagan elected twice, and then his vice president, George H.W. Bush, and then his son, George W. Bush, very much beloved of that community. And this had been a huge part of the Republican base, the Republican electorate for decades, for generations. They held their nose and endorsed and voted for Donald Trump. I don't know if that'll be the case anymore. I think this is changing. I think that a younger generation of evangelicals is less automatically sort of wedded to the Republican candidates. When it comes to environmentalism, there's this idea of creation care, that maybe we should take care of the planet that God gave us rather than crapping it up. So I think that's changing. But yes, to my mind, this is the big, at least in anyone's living memory, the big example of politics and religion intersecting, at least in the context of American politics.
I forget the name though of a particular group of evangelicals who uh, rallied against Donald Trump near the end of his mandate. I just can't remember the name of it, but there is a group of evangelicals, or even several groups of evangelicals, that are probably against what Donald Trump has done. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was trying to suggest that in recent years, the religious right or the evangelical community, which at times has been one quarter of the American electorate, but 25% of people who bother to vote would self identify as evangelical, that this group is increasingly not monolithic,
Hmm.
that has divided loyalties and is prepared to vote for someone other than a Republican. I mean, Biden's Catholicism kind of cuts both ways with that group. But I think the days of evangelicals being 25% of the American electorate are gone. And I think the days of that bloc being a monolithic bloc that would support Republicans are also gone.
Interesting. Yeah, and like one name that comes to mind is Jimmy Carter, who obviously was part of the Democratic Party, and he was heavy with evangelicals, like a lot of
Yeah,
evangelicals
yeah.
back then.
Carter was born again, and the evangelicals were happy to have him. The story is that once he then announced his support for abortion, that relationship became strained, and many of those people moved to support Ronald Reagan in 1980 against Jimmy Carter.
Interesting. Yeah, that's and the abortion issue is definitely something interesting because Roe v. Wade, I believe, got, correct me if I'm wrong, got overturned last year.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right. So it had been a decades long project of conservative evangelicals to erode and eventually reverse abortion rights. And, it took them a half century, but they succeeded.
Hmm.
Yeah, abortion is no longer a constitutional right in the United States. At the federal level, it is left up to states to decide. And many states with Republican majorities have, if not outlawed or banned it altogether, at least severely restricted it, such that 10-year-old rape victims can't get an abortion now in many states. And many people think that's going too far, including not a few Republicans. And I think that that's something that did help Democrats in the last elections, and it may well help them again this coming year. But yeah, the place of abortion in life has just been such a politically uh, uh, salient issue and just a flashpoint of politics
Right.
and public life in the U.S. in a way that it's not here, at least not in sort of secular Quebec. I can't vouch for conservative communities, say in rural Alberta, stereotypically, but in the U.S., man, it's a big deal.
I guess so. And I've dreadfully had this debate with folks on both ends. And to be perfectly honest with you, I've come out of it very not disgusted, but a bit, how could I say, disappointed
Yeah.
from those debates because I've always had like an ambivalent point of view when it comes to the abortion topic. So because I try to be empathetic um, for both ends, for folks on both ends. I've had this debate with folks on the right who have been staunch in their position not to have abortions at all or not to allow abortions, and they've had good arguments. Some of them were bad arguments, and I've had this conversation with folks on the left who can't understand how in some cases I may be against abortions, but not in others, where they want abortion to be green lighted across the board, which is not my position at all, right? So having that ambivalent position and being in the middle of that tug of war is something that I just don't want to revisit ever again. But I definitely, keep my ears open to different opinions when it comes to that particular matter, just like any other particular matters. Like I know, like we're talking about presidents, but we can also talk about senators, like or rather governors, like Ron DeSantis in Florida, and he's been receiving a lot of praise for the way he dealt with COVID-19 in Florida. Obviously, folks on the left may have some things to say about that as well. And the big issue right now, in my mind, uh, is no longer abortion per se, but drag shows in schools. And
Hmm.
I'm looking at it from a political point of view, but also from a societal point of view. Um, and I think Ron DeSantis has had his fair share or not his fair share, but I would say his positioning when it comes to drag shows in schools. It's not something that I really want to ask you per se because I think it kind of like leaks out of your field. But it's something, yeah, it's something of a political matter where, okay, well, are we going to pass laws to ban drag shows in schools or not? From my personal point of view, my uneducated point of view, to say it humbly, I would be absolutely against drag shows in schools because I don't want my kids to be exposed or over sexualized, and I think that's a fair assessment. But then again, like if we fast forward to 5 years, am I going to have that same point of view? Am I going to be more acquainted with this particular issue? I don't know. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because, I think a decade ago, I had that particular um, uh, standpoint facing abortion,
Hmm.
right? So yeah, I think that's these different topics and different things that the United States is grappling with is super interesting to look into. But now that you're in Canada, I want to know like, okay, how do we analogically look at Canada the way that we look at the United States? Can we look at Canada in the same way, or how do we grapple with all this?
Yeah, so I mean, speaking as a political scientist, it's a different system here. I mean, Canadian provinces get to do a lot more than American states do, for better or worse, depending on your point of view. In other words, the balance of federalism is different here, and that allows places like Quebec to do an awful lot more than, say, places like Pennsylvania. Um, so it's a different system here in terms of federalism. It's a different system here in terms of the parliamentary system. Justin Trudeau doesn't have to worry about a separate legislature that may or may not want to do what he wants to do. So it's different. And, at least until recently, I think the culture here was different as well. The things you were just talking about and your last comments about this, what we call the culture wars in the United
Yeah.
States. And, for years, abortion's been at the top of that list. These days, it has to do with critical race theory and the acceptance or tolerance of sexual and gender differences. And this is something that conservatives are very worked up about, and that some conservative politicians in the U.S. have made great hay with, especially Ron DeSantis. Again, my sense is that there are these differences here in Canada, but they are not as bad, at least yet, as in the United States. But I think one of the broader trends is that there is a sense in which Canadian politics is becoming more American, and that's probably worrisome. It may not be a good thing, but I think it is what it is. You can see this just in terms of the tone of political rhetoric. I mean, Donald Trump sort of shattered a lot of these norms about things you can say and ways you can act. And I don't think that Joe Biden has been able to reestablish those old norms. So going forward, I think the kind of caustic rhetoric that we've seen the last few years is increasingly just going to be a fact of life. Is that going to come here? Yeah, it might. It might. So, there's this old saying, what when the U.S. sneezes, Canada catches a cold. Point being that what happens south of the border does not stay south of the border, and these broader trends, Canada's not immune to them.
Right. I mean, it comes down the pipe, right? I should say up the pipe, upward,
Yeah.
which is 100% predictable. They're basically, number one trading partner both ways, and they're, the adjacent neighbor, territorially, geographically. So it's quite obvious that whenever it happens in America, will have a ripple effect in Canada. But right now, the funny thing, well, not so funny actually, is the forest fires that are happening right now, and it's kind of it's saying the same thing but in a different direction. Where now New York City and Boston are covered with fog, and it's ridiculous. But that's more of a chemical example rather than an ideological or political example. Um, I want to talk about your book. Take up your pen.
Okay.
So what was the motivation behind writing Take Up Your Pen, and what is it about?
Sure, sure. So this was my first book. I've got three of them now. This is a book that grew out of my dissertation, and it was on the pretty much straight ahead American politics. So we're back to American stuff. And it was a study of executive orders. Executive orders are legal documents whereby the president can make binding policy by a mere stroke of the pen. And these things have not much constitutional warrant. They have some legislative warrant, but basically it's a practice that just sort of developed historically over time. And it's now more or less accepted that presidents can do this, and they have done it for great effect. There's hardly a controversial issue in the U.S. that has not had an executive order involved with it at some point. I mean, controversial examples include abortion, organized labor, the creation of the Peace Corps by JFK, the creation of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives under George W. Bush, any number of things. And I find it interesting in a system of separate institutions, executive and legislative, that the executive can legislate without the legislature. So my book was, where did this practice come from? How has it been used? And what has its impact been? So sort of a developmental history of executive orders.
Developmental history of executive orders. Okay, that's very interesting. And now, could you could you please define like what exactly is an executive order?
There is no real definition of these things. Presidents can do an awful lot of stuff individually, unilaterally, without Congress or cabinet or anybody else. And by some counts, there are about 30 different types of unilateral presidential directives. So, in my own parlance, the broader genre of thing would be unilateral presidential directive, of which the most prominent and I think important example is an executive order. But these things usually these days have the look of a law. It will say, whereas such and such is going on, and whereas there's this problem, and whereas further the Constitution or this law permits me to do X, therefore I, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, do hereby declare that, we'll have a ban on Muslims immigrating to the United States, for example. This is not a hypothetical example. This is a real
A
example.
literal example, yeah.
So, these things are, again, quite controversial, no matter what your politics might be. But my own sense is that they should also be controversial at the standpoint of constitutionalism. How can it be? Is it bad that in a democratic society so much governance occurs by the unilateral actions of the individual who's the head of one of three branches of government?
That's super interesting. And yet, now we're talking about presidents and all that, and I just recalled 5 seconds ago, that over a month ago I had Dr. Eric Buzetti on the show, and he probably talked to you about it. And not sure if he enjoyed the podcast or not. He said that he did, but hopefully he wasn't being politically correct, and no pun intended. But yeah, I mean, the discussion that I had with Dr. Buzetti was very interesting because at the time we were in the news. There was this whole issue with Donald Trump's scandal with Stormy Daniels, and payment or lack thereof for whatever sexual services and that kind of thing. Um, Now that we hear about Donald Trump getting showered with different accusations. I'm not even sure if they're true or false. Like, I'd like to know like your standpoint on this.
Wow. Well, this might be out of date by the end of today at the rate things are going with Donald Trump's legal troubles. I mean, he's a guy who has had legal troubles throughout his career. He and his father were sued for racial discrimination and being landlords in New York City decades ago. Um, he's had all sorts of other legal problems. But, as a public figure, as a president at least, he very much shattered all sorts of norms, traditions, sort of ways of doing things. He was criticized for being unpresidential, and he said, "No, no, I'm being new presidential. This is the way people are now."
Yeah.
And okay, fine. Maybe in our private lives, people aren't always as guarded as politicians used to be, but it used to be the case that you could not discriminate against whole groups of people with impunity, and post Trump, you can do that. You can say, he's a Mexican judge. He can't hear this case. He's
Mm.
biased because of his heritage. That is racism. And that's what the Republican Speaker of the House said. It's not my own definition, it's one from his own team. So, yeah, Donald Trump broke down many barriers, and it wasn't just social niceties that he was violating. He was arguably violating the law as well. There's this principle in the United States that nobody is above the law, including the president. This is something people talked about with Richard Nixon back in the day. And it seems that, at least allegedly, we have to say that he has violated many of these laws. There was the civil suit about a woman he had allegedly raped when he said, he cast dispersions on her character that she was saying he's impugned my character, and that was upheld. He further impugned her, and she said, "Well, I'd like some more money, please. The more you talk, the more money I get." So
Mm.
that's happening. There's this um, uh, payment for a tryst with a porn star that ran afoul, it seems, of campaign finance laws. That's being litigated as we speak. And now there are two cases at the federal level, the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, one regarding his handling or mishandling of top secret documents in his Florida residence, Mar-a-Lago, the other involving his encouragement of the attack on the U.S. Capitol of January after the election. And then, fifth, if I haven't lost track here, last but not least, there may well be a forthcoming case out of Atlanta, Georgia, concerning trying to get fake electors in the Electoral College. So he's got an awful lot to be worried about when it comes to legal matters. People say that to get an indictment in front of the grand jury, you've got to have pretty good evidence. And I think that's true. I have to say, my uncle was a district attorney, and he always said, Graham, if there's a case, the person is guilty. The only question is, can the state prove it? Now, that was his biased point of view.
I don't
But
necessarily agree with
no,
that.
I don't either. I don't either. But the point is, you don't usually find major cases being prosecuted without some sort of evidence, especially against a former president, when if there were a lack of evidence, if it were just made up, that would be deeply problematic, and that reality would come out. So you got to think there's something to at least some of these, five cases as I've outlined them. But Donald Trump has been very good throughout his public life at sort of playing the legal game, at deferring and stretching things out. And it's a sad fact that people with money can game the American judicial system in this way. If you have deep pockets, you fire off, objection after objection after objection, and you hire a team of lawyers that will litigate these things over months and years. And 5 years and $100 million later, the other side you're hoping will say, "Okay, I've run out of money. I'm tired, Uncle. I give up. Don't worry about it."
Run out
And
of stamina.
and he's been very effective at doing that throughout his career. I don't know if he's going to be able to do that with all of these cases going forward. Um, and frankly, whether he's successful or not, this is something that is going to get in his way as he's campaigning for a return to the White House in 2024. I mean, on a given day, 9 to 5, several hours are going to be taken up with the latest legal developments. So this is, from a managerial point of view, a time management point of view, it's a hassle to have to deal with all these things
Yeah.
instead of going out and campaigning.
Right. And I mean, a lot of folks that are not necessarily his supporters are saying that maybe it's the media's way or the left's way to, throw these spokes or these sticks into his wheel and, derail him from actually campaigning and running for president. Is there any veracity to that?
It's true. People are saying this, that this is the deep state trying to get back at Trump. They couldn't vote him out of office, so now they're just trying to get him with dirty
Just
lawsuits.
mudslinging
And
at him, and
I have to think again that there is some kernel of truth to some of these many allegations that have now resulted in serious charges being leveled at him at multiple levels in multiple localities. There are times where I wish the left were sufficiently organized to mount a campaign like this, but they're just not. Even if you take the right wing criticism at face value to say, okay, there's a cabal of deep state people who are getting organized to launch these things. Please, the left has never been that organized. It's just laughable.
but how so? Like, I mean, because my supervisors often told me that the right, especially the religious right, evangelicals, and not only evangelicals, but anybody who's like on the right, maybe not the alt right, but just the right, are super organized. But how come the left isn't as symmetrically
This
organized?
is a very old question to which there is no good answer. I don't know if it's just that different politics match different sort of personal proclivities in terms of organization. Maybe it's just a fact of money. I don't know. But the fact is, there is no Fox News of the left. CNN has moved a little bit that way, but no, the right has for years and years had a massive, fairly organized, institutionalized presence that the left has not. It just hasn't. I mean, people on the right will say, well, they've got academia, they've got those legions of professors. Well, maybe. Um, but legions of professors, sadly, don't have as much impact as huge corporations and bazillionaires. Would that it were so, but it's not.
That's interesting because I think the same argument would be cried out from folks on the right, where they would say that, look, the left has the media, they have CNN, MSNBC, the universities, just these three different entities and institutions are big powerhouses. We Hollywood, that's another one that the left has. So when we look at folks, and I'd be tempted to believe that, hey, you know what, maybe the right is right on these particular matters, where Hollywood is definitely left leaning, with different messages relating to LGBTQ or CRT, and the universities are definitely a leftist environment. Especially, you look at Concordia, you look at McGill. I mean, even in the United States, Cal Berkeley, Harvard, Yale. So when it comes to institutionalization, I'm having a hard time understanding how the left can't be so organized.
It's just not, man. It's
It's
just
not.
not, honestly. Professors do lean left. I believe the conservatives are right to point that out. And look, this is something that we're not just discussing right here now, you and me. This is part of the Ron DeSantis conservative critique of culture, saying that high school parents, be careful what they're making your kids read. So they're book burning. In 2023, they are burning books
But
in the
are those
United States, often that people have not even read, just because they get an email from a conservative group that they happen to think they agree with. So yeah, they're saying you can't teach about gender and sex differences, that you can't teach critical race theory, which nobody even knows what that is, as if your kids are being indoctrinated by high school teachers. I think this is overblown, as you can perhaps tell from my tone. But my own view notwithstanding, this does have a lot of traction. There are a lot of moderate and conservative parents and voters in the United States, I'm talking about, who are receptive to this message, and are probably going to vote for Ron DeSantis because they perceive him as a culture warrior who will prevent their 16-year-olds from being indoctrinated in the politics of Hollywood, or I don't know who the boogeyman of the day is. It used to be Barbara Streisand. I don't know who it is now. The sort of
Dylan Mulvaney, perhaps?
there, perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's what book burning is a very interesting phrase there to coin, because okay, well, what is Ron doing? Is he just removing the books that may be overly sexualized in libraries that kids under the age of 18 should not be sniffing or reading, right? Is he doing that, or is he literally going back to the Inquisition days, where like we were burning people at the stake, and perhaps even in the Middle Ages, or I don't know which time period, when people were actually burning books? Or we can talk about the Catholic Church, perhaps discarding a whole bunch of books, or just putting them in a different repertoire, like in a dark corner where it's off limits and only certain people have access to. Now, I'm not heavily informed on the matter, but if he's removing things that are harmful, like perhaps you know books describing how to do particular sexual acts, then I put myself in these parents' shoes and I'm starting to think, okay, maybe these parent boards have a point. Maybe I don't want my children to read that kind of stuff at a particular age. I was taught sex ed when I was in fifth grade, but it was heavily framed in a way that we weren't necessarily. It wasn't graphic and encouraged in a way that that may be harmful or traumatizing, in a particular way. So yeah, it's definitely another area that needs a lot of investigation. And again, going back to political science, different political scientists may have different points of view. Um, Now, I don't believe all political scientists are left leaning, especially in academia. There may be some political scientists that are more right leaning, and having worked, I believe, in the States and in Canada, have you met folks that with whom you've had differences of opinion,
Oh, of course, of course,
colleagues?
of course. Academia is fantastically diverse. Yes, both here in Canada and in the U.S. Yes, it is just not the case that all professors are card-carrying leftists. It's laughable. It's not the true. It's not the case at all. No, there's diversity, certainly ideological diversity in academia, and I think some students can sort of figure that out. I usually try to keep my own politics mostly out of things, and I think I'm usually mostly successful at that. You'd have to ask my students, but no. I have wonderful conservative friends and colleagues here at this very institution, so they exist.
Oh, there are. Because I better meet them because I don't know if there are
They're
at
out there,
Concordia,
man.
but
They're out
they're
there.
out there. Okay, they're probably closeted. I don't know. Yeah, perhaps. So yeah, and so have you had the chance to work closely with them on different projects?
Sure,
Or
sure,
okay.
of course, of course, of course. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of aspects of political science don't neatly map onto the traditional left right ideological divides. It's life and the academic study of politics are much more nuanced than that. So, I think this is true, for example, of the Supreme Court, where it's not just about liberal conservative, it's about your view of federalism or, state power or this, that, or the other doctrine that may or may not nicely map onto the traditional sort of left right divides. So, that basic ideological difference matters. I'm not saying it doesn't, but life is more complicated than that. I think academia is as well.
Yeah, and I've had the chance to actually, from a theological point of view, I've had the chance to basically have these different conversations with folks that have different ideologies, and I think, after 2 years of a master's program, I do realize that it's not only left and right. You can have different positions, um, and there is a non-binary element to political points of view that does bring a richness to it, and I think it's pretty interesting to know that that these different viewpoints are allowed to flourish in academia, and that's something that I think the United States is struggling a lot with, and this is the point where I kind of empathize with, for example, Brett Weinstein, who, regardless of his point of views, uh, went through a very difficult experience at Evergreen. And yeah, I mean, you may differ with me on this issue, but to have folks at the university level, especially students, um, go wild and act in a particular way that is unacademic, right? I think that's something that shouldn't happen in universities where opinions should be said. And as dangerous as the university landscape can be from a psychological, ideological point of view, it's very important to wrestle with these different questions and find these different answers to these inquiries. And there is a growing concern, I think, especially in the States. I'm not sure if it's that much in Canada, where universities, and this is where I'll actually delve into teaching because you're an award-winning teacher, so which is great. Congrats on that.
Thank you.
It's hard for me to understand. Like, does university have a gloomy, dark future ahead of it, where um, opinions may only be regulated under a totalitarian um, umbrella or not?
Well, this also is a very big question, I think. And this is one area in which I'm happy to share my own personal view, which is I have a very robust sense of acceptable speech. I think that people should be prepared to hear things they don't agree with and maybe even that they find troubling. And I think this is part of what a good undergraduate experience should be. It was certainly my own. So I'm against speech codes. I'm against shouting down speakers who you might disagree with. And it's to my mind, there's sort of a generational divide on this. I mean, stereotypically, at least, or in terms of polling, it's younger people, it's people who are in college or university now who tend to be more supportive of restricting speech, of having, oh, everything from trigger warnings to no, you can't have that person come to campus. I am opposed to all of that. And, some people say, well, easy for you. You're middle class. You're a straight white male. Yeah, okay, I get that,
Yeah.
but it's still my view. And I'm opposed to that. And to their credit, when I've talked with my own students about this, a majority of them at least have said, we agree with you, Professor Dodds. We don't agree with most of what people in our generation are saying. So I don't know if this is changing among contemporary undergraduates at Concordia and elsewhere. But stereotypically, there's this view that younger students, and I think this is the sort of thing people started to articulate with millennials some time ago, are snowflakes who can't bear to confront something that is less than pleasant or in accord with their own worldview. And I just think that's terrible. And it has happened here at Concordia. I mean, the liberal arts college disinvited a great conservative political theorist from Harvard, and I think that very much hurt this place's reputation. And sadly, those harms take a long time to heal.
Now, how long ago was that? Like a year ago?
I'm
Because
going
I'm
to say
kind
about
of
5 years.
5 years ago. Because I ran into someone who I think works closely with the liberal arts college. I forgot her last name. Her first name is Julie. And her I know her son Darcy through a friend, and I spoke to Julie about this. Whom the last name shall not be named. I don't know what her last name is, and she told me that was completely disgraceful to disinvite someone um, based on a particular point of view. Now, if they're spreading any form of extremism, whether it be far right or far left, I can understand that. Sometimes you have to turn off the tap when it comes to certain things that can be said, because I'm not an absolutist when it comes to free speech. I'm a huge fan of free speech. I like to turn on the tap pretty wide, but to a certain extent. And obviously, Twitter is another debate in and of itself, with the takeover by Elon Musk and what it means for free speech and that kind of thing. A lot of people are happy with it because prior to Elon Musk, apparently, like free speech was somewhat hindered, and that, again, that's probably a right leaning point of view. So yeah, like, now you don't need to answer this question, but what's the name of that person, that the conservative person that from Harvard?
Harvey Mansfield. Harvey Mansfield.
Harvey
He's a
Mansfield.
very well known sort of public intellectual, but a political theorist of decades standing who is controversial and provocative. But that's fine. People should be provoked and encouraged to engage with ideas that they might not agree with. Right. This is part of what it is to be a person in the world. We live in a fantastically diverse world. You can't hide from things you don't like. But I agree with you, Christopher, that if someone is spouting violence, well, that's another story. And I think we can draw a line at that point. But just because you disagree with what they have to say or you find it troubling, tough, grow up, deal with it.
Right. And I'm glad to know that you, as a university professor, are having this point of view where you're open to having these conversations, and to encourage people to toughen up and take on life as it is, instead of being a snowflake. Because, again, as a podcaster, oftentimes I feel like I'm walking on eggshells when it comes to asking questions to different professors.
Yeah.
You're my 17th interview, and thankfully nothing bad has happened. Nobody has walked off. Like, for instance, in the What Is a Woman, Matt Walsh documentary, where a couple of folks have walked off his interview set, and he actually documented that audio visually so people can see. But it's good to see that most of the actually all of the profs and guests that I've had on the show were open enough to have these different conversations, and certain conversations are made to be difficult. Um, and when you're talking about provocative, some names that come to mind are obviously Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles.
Hmm. Hmm.
When they say what they have to say. Um, and I explicitly think about Michael Knowles just recently, on the Young America's Foundation, um, when it comes to transgenderism and different politically tainted culture wars that are going on in the United States. Whether you'd like to agree with them or not, I may disagree with some things that he says. I may agree with some things that he says, but I definitely disagree with somebody trying to tackle him on stage.
Yeah.
Right
Yeah.
when things become uncivilized and um, decorum is breached, well, that's it's absolutely unacceptable. And my fear, as a 28-year-old MA student, is well, if I'm going to one day walk into those types of shoes, whether it be Matt Walsh or any any person's shoes, where left leaning or right leaning, I may have to talk about my ideas. Should I be like fearful of getting tackled or hit by somebody or having a 9-volt battery thrown at my face? Like because that's where we seem to be navigating towards as a civilization or lack thereof, right?
Well, hopefully not. Hopefully not, man. And um, there's this debate about whether uh, uh, problematic extremist rhetoric leads to results in is conducive to violence. And I think, frankly, the evidence is mixed. Nevertheless, um, I think that when someone speaks in a way that is offensive, you can call it out without silencing them. And to my mind, Donald Trump is the person here, right? When he spouts racist, misogynist, offensive, undignified, uncivilized things, as he does many times a day, you can call it out without saying, well, you don't have the right to speak anymore. Now, with him being silenced on social media, well, was he encouraging violence at the U.S. Capitol? Well, maybe. Was he spouting lies multiple times a day? Yes, demonstrably, tens of thousands of times during his presidency. So, should you be allowed on social media to say things that are just demonstrably false? Maybe. Um, Frankly, people should not get their news from social media. So,
Absolutely not.
if Trump's going to get on there and say, well, the deep state is in league with the aliens and, they've gone back in time and they've redone the results of the 2020 election and some kind of crazy thing like this I'm coming up with off the top of my head. Um, does that mean he should be deplatformed? No. But if he is encouraging hate and violence, maybe. Maybe. And this gets back to Ron DeSantis. I mean, the don't say gay thing. I mean, his state regulations literally prohibit the discussion of some of these topics, which I think is going too far. I mean, look, when you're saying Walt Disney is un American, no. Walt Disney is quintessentially American. If you have a beef
Yeah,
with Walt Disney, you have a beef with the United States.
right.
So,
It's definitely an American product through and through. And whether Walt Disney may be, well, maybe when I try to wrap my head around, okay, what does it mean when he claims that Walt Disney is not American, and what does he mean by "don't say gay"? Perhaps the values or the messaging or whatever Walt Disney is promoting, maybe that's not what he's calling, good old fashioned America, or I'm not even sure. Like it's something that is it's definitely worth exploring because as a product, Walt Disney is a 100% American product, just like hamburgers and mac and cheese, I guess. But yeah, like perhaps a lot of these people that support DeSantis and DeSantis himself might be thinking that given the quote unquote debauchery that's going on in the United States, perhaps Walt Disney's not American from a traditionalist point of view.
maybe it's a strange world where someone's going to say Walt Disney is anything other than G-rated traditional America, but that is what the right is saying, which I think says something about them rather than the reality of Walt Disney. But Mr. DeSantis has tens of millions of people who think otherwise. So
I'd really, this just popped up in my imagination. I'd really like to see a conversation between you and Ron DeSantis, which I think would go very well. Just by watching how DeSantis is temperamentally, and with what seems to be your temperament, I think the conversation could be very interesting to see, like the back and forth
we'll see.
arguments.
We'll see. He will be asked these questions by people who are better able to speak off the top of their head than I am in the coming months as he is a candidate for president. So I'm sure that there will be journalists and other candidates who ask him these questions.
Yeah, and I'd be definitely curious to see that because I think he just very recently said that he'd be running, which is going to be super interesting because I'm looking at the different candidates that are throwing their names in the hat. I've heard about Michelle Obama wanting to follow in her husband's footsteps. Usually people follow into their parents' footsteps, but it's quite interesting to see that dynamic. RFK, Vivek Ramaswamy. You have Donald Trump, of course, and you have Ron DeSantis, and that's only to name a few. Obviously, there are other people that want to run, and the elections are, pretty soon. I think it's 2024. Do you have any predictions?
No, ever since 2016, I've gotten out of the prediction business because, like many people, I thought Donald Trump had no chance. And, guess what happens? So clearly he had sort of ridden a wave that I had not perceived coming, or that he had tapped into an element in America that I didn't think was nearly as big as apparently it was, for better or worse. So, no predictions, man. No.
Well, for everything that people could say about Donald Trump, there's one huge positive I just want to give the guy. Whether he's a good guy or bad guy at heart, we'll never know. We don't live inside his head. But this guy is by far one of the best marketers I've ever seen. From a marketing point of view, if we forget about politics, I took a certificate in marketing at McGill, which was a lot of fun because I do work in marketing a lot. From a marketing point of view, the guy's an absolute genius. We have to give him that he knows how to broadcast himself, how to market and sell himself to an audience, how to emotionally elicit different reactions in a crowd, and reiterate different talking points for the common folk. Like it's amazing when you look at it. Like
It's true.
it's
It's
an
true.
art. It's an art form.
He has this ability. I don't think it's a conscious ability. I think it's just a function of who he is, something he gets intuitively. I don't think it operates at the level of sort of well orchestrated, thought out strategy. It's just not how his mind works, in my view. But no, he has this ability to give a segment of the people what they want, to give voice to what some people want to hear. Uh, uh, Often it's the basket full of deplorables and racists that Hillary Clinton mentioned. People who, well, they can say what they want, but I'd rather not hear it. Thank you very much. But yes, he clearly tapped into something. There is no denying that. And throughout his career, he has been expert at manipulating the media, succeeding in these long drawn out law cases, as I had mentioned earlier, and sort of getting his name out there and in the spotlight. So no one would deny that he has certain abilities. It's true.
And you know, I took a public speaking class these past few weeks. It ended on Wednesday, and we were looking at these different people. Whether it be Martin Luther King Jr., Steve Jobs, Adolf Hitler, and Donald Trump. We were looking at their ability to speak in public and um, learn. Even if they're good guys or villains, doesn't matter. Just to learn how they actually promote themselves or address an audience in a public setting. And one of the students said, "Oh well, Donald Trump appeals to stupid people." I'm pretty sure there are a lot of smart people in that crowd. I try to be optimistic and positive about it, but but they still get emotionally riled up by what Donald Trump has to say. Like I'm pretty sure that the stereotypical, um, let's just keep it at stupid person, um, is not a avatar persona that is suitable and fits everybody in that crowd or in
Yeah.
that in these Trump
Yeah.
rallies.
I mean, look, tens of millions of people voted for the guy. Not
Yeah.
every one of them is going to be of a certain type. It is true. However, it is the case, at least in contemporary American politics, that increasingly people who are better educated will vote for Democrats, and people who are less well educated, who've ended before high school or only with high school will disproportionately vote for Republicans. Back in 2016, Trump had a great quote where he said, "We love the undereducated voters." And I remember there was a guy on stage who's like, "Yeah, oh, hey, wait a minute, is that a sly cut at me?" And he was sort of conflicted about whether to embrace that characterization. So that's an interesting thing about American politics. That again, people who are better educated, more educated, who've gone to school for a longer period of time, will disproportionately vote for Democrats and vice versa for Republicans. So there's some truth to that, but no, there are more than a few smart people who like Mr. Trump and what he's selling.
Right. I mean, yeah, that speaks to the difference of opinion that exists everywhere, in every country, but especially in the United States. And it's kind of ironic to hear him say that he likes quote unquote uneducated folks, because I mean, the guy has a bachelor's degree in finance from Wharton, I think. So he is university educated. He completed all his credits, and he has that degree. So he's not an uneducated person. It's just that I think again he's targeting the extremely left leaning university personnel or institutions or academics that may be heavily against Trump, from a political point of view, ideologically speaking. Um, just to rapidly bring it back to Canada, because we were talking about legalities and the legal troubles that Trump is facing, I want to know your stance on the legal troubles that perhaps Mr. Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, may be facing when it comes to, for example, We Charity, when it comes to David Johnston, um, China's implications in the or electoral interference, the probability of. I want to know some more about that.
I'm gonna have to punt on this one. Although I am Canadian and I do traffic in aspects of Canadian politics. Canadian politics per se is not my primary of expertise. I've not been trained in it. I don't teach in it per se. So I'm gonna have to leave that for one of my Canadian politics colleagues. You can have them on and ask them. But as for the details of the challenges that Mr. Trudeau is facing today, I'm not prepared to go there today. Sorry.
Oh no, not a problem. Who would be those colleagues? Like,
Well, we've got a whole slew of people who teach Canadian politics, probably half dozen or more as to who's here and not sabbatical and who's teaching. You'd have to look that up. But no, we have more than a few people at the Department of Political Science who focus very squarely on Canadian politics.
yeah, I would definitely like to have him on the show, and especially I've been told to kind of intertwine theology with politics to understand like the religious point of view within the political sphere, because it seems to me that religion and politics are very hard to separate, and especially when it comes to American politics. Dr. Gagne has worked heavily on the evangelicals, especially on the Christian right, or I don't know what to say. Do we say religious right or Christian right? Like when we're talking about the right.
At least in American parlance, one used to say the religious right, and I think that's a label that was accepted by many people who it was intended to describe. There was the moral majority under Jerry Falwell, and that was the main part of what people called the religious rights. Jerry Falwell being part of that as well. Pat Robertson, I should say. I think evangelicals is sort of the preferred term, but it's hard to say. And then now increasingly there's another variant, which is sort of called Christian nationalism,
Right.
which is sort
Yeah.
of the racist aspects of the Trump coalition wed to the old religious right. People whose eschatology, I suppose, depicts a white Christian nation that is increasingly under siege by the forces of modernity. And many people give some credence to that particular orientation.
Well, from a biology point of view, I did my undergraduate degrees, my undergraduate degree in biochemistry, which is a weird transition to leap into theology. But I think I'm more interested in the abstract, philosophical and theological disciplines, humanities, more than a couple 5 years ago when I graduated with biochem. I was much more in the pragmatic and concrete. From a biological point of view, I equate that with genotype and phenotype. And just to define that terminology, a genotype is basically what's part of your genetic makeup, and it's the hiding um, precursor to whatever's going to be manifested. And what's manifested is your phenotype, right? It's basically how tall you are, 5'11", 6'9", or blue eyes, blue eyes, black eyes, or brown eyes, whatever. And when I look at I don't know why I'm talking about this. I just remember. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Because when I look at the manifestation of what's going on right now in the landscape, it seems to me that um, what we see at the forefront with the religious right or the Christian right uh, is probably the output of something that was buried or hidden for a certain period of time, and now it seems to, as a new term, Christian nationalism. It seemed to be the blossoming of something that was concealed, and I'm not sure if that's true, if that's conspiratorial.
I think there's a lot to that, and that kind of fits my usual academic predisposition to say things don't come from nowhere, that there are long historical developmental trajectories that produce contemporary political phenomena, and this is surely one of them. There are many good dissertations to be written on this topic because, sad to say, I don't think this thing's going away anytime soon. But to my mind, one way to sort of make quick sense of it is that this is of a piece with the stereotypical Trumpist Republican voter who, sort of an undereducated white male, perhaps religious or not, who felt that their place was increasingly under siege, or perhaps their privileged position is something that they won't be able to count on in an America that is increasingly diverse, in an America that's less and less Christian, that's more and more non-white, so whatever terms we want to use here, that sort of thing. And I think many people are bothered by those sort of long-term demographic changes and do feel threatened. And whether that's a rational response, we can debate, but it's a real emotional response that many people have, regardless. Another way that I would sort of make sense of it more particularly is that Trump gave latent racists the courage to give voice to their dark secrets that they had not been willing to pass their lips. There's more latent racism and bigotry in America than I had realized. And Trump, God bless him, has brought that out. I think it is sad that these impulses are always there. In this respect, I'm quite conservative. I don't think the human species much advances in that our darker natures are ever with us. And if they are not sort of harnessed and kept down, they can lead to truly terrible things. And Mr. Trump has, this is Pandora's box, and it's kind of open now.
And you know why I find this thing absolutely weird, because I'm very open about my religion. I'm a Christian. I grew up Catholic. Now I'm more of an overarching Christian. I go to evangelical services, Orthodox services, have friends in all circles. They invite me to their different liturgies and whatever. And I do believe in God. I do believe in Jesus. But I've always conceived of Christianity as loving your neighbor, loving thy neighbor as thyself, right? And if I see these types of outbursts or uproars of different forms of nationalisms that may lead to violence, obviously that's an unchristian type of movement, and um, I've always been educated on empathy, in any domain and whatever. If I ever work in politics one day, or if I ever work in academia, because I do want to become a professor and teach stage reps in universities, I always want to act in a Christian way, but in a true Christian way. That's where the theological and more of a religious um, output comes, in this particular type of setting where we're, on a podcast talking about theology, and especially, given that you're from political science, we're talking about politics and these types of things. Um, could there be a way that, a Christian leader acts in a loving way,
Sure, sure.
promoting love?
Yeah. I mean, Martin Luther King is the exemplar, right? The civil rights movement of the mid 20th century was closely wedded to the Black church through Dr. King and others. So, to my mind, that was an aspect of Christianity that focused on things that, frankly, the religious right did not focus on. The aspects of Christianity that are mainly based on humility, on care for the poor and the downtrodden. What is it easier for a rich man to do than enter the kingdom of heaven, pass through the eye of a needle? Well,
Right.
you don't hear Donald Trump talking about that much, do you? But no, historically there have been elements of political Christianity that have talked about that. Is there an opening for a sort of liberal or progressive evangelicalism? I don't know. I mean, those are, as you know, the aspects of church-going Americans that have declined in recent decades. The
Right.
sort of mainstream Protestant divisions have really seen their attendance plummet, and it's been the more evangelical and frankly conservative denominations and churches that have seen a growth, at least until recent years. Does that mean the market no longer exists, politically speaking, for a sort of liberal Christianity to have a political voice? No, I think it's out there. I think it's out there. I don't know if it's a major constituency. I mean, you know, the of course the percent of the U.S. population that says they're secular grows every year.
Yeah.
The electorate in 2024 will have
Right.
fewer religious people of any stripe than 4 years ago. So I think this is from the Democratic. I think Republican candidates still need to mouth these pieties, need to let the vestiges of the religious right know that they're with them. On the left, I don't know. I mean, you know, one sort of thought experiment rather would be: could Democrats elect someone who said, you know, I'm just not very religious? Um, I don't know if someone could do that. I don't know. That might accurately describe Barack Obama, but I don't think he could talk that way. So, uh, you know, Joe Biden is by all accounts fairly devout in his Catholicism. I'm trying to think of the other candidates who are up right now, and I can't think of a single one who would say, I'm pretty secular.
Maybe Yang. Was his
I've
first name
forgotten about him.
Daniel? What's his?
I don't think that's quite right, but I've forgotten. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's yeah, and again, I can't recall any president, whether it be Democrat or Republican, that did not profess some sort of faith. And uh, I'm thinking about Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton. I'm pretty sure that they may profess to be a Christian or whatever, but again, like I think actions speak louder than words. Then that's where different arguments, especially from the right, may claim that, for instance, Joe Biden may be like outwardly or outspokenly a Catholic, but the things that he's doing or whatever are not. Do not fit the bill for Catholicism or Christianity per se. So, and again, that would be another conversation. As we're segueing towards the end of the podcast, I'm pretty sure you have a whole bunch of other things to do. Um, just to brag a little bit about myself, being McGill educated and Harvard educated in my own right. I took a few certificates at McGill, and I just completed the Harvard Derek Bach higher education teaching in the I think it's part of the Harvard uh, part of Harvard University, but I took that higher education teaching diploma to learn what it is to be a better professor. And as I was reading through your description here, the bio, once again, you're an award-winning professor, and you basically, I believe, you coached other professors. You gave workshops on how to be better at teaching, right? And I think that would be a nice little way to segue towards the conclusion. Like when it comes to teaching in university, what were some of your tips or some of the things that you encountered as a teaching coach almost?
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. For it's been a while now, but some years back, I was involved with the training of new teaching assistants for university, at least in the arts and sciences. And I've given other presentations, seminars, workshops with the Center for Teaching and Learning Services. Now it's been a little while since I've done these, so in terms of the kind of bullet points I was trying to get across, I'll have to scratch my head here a minute and see if I can remember. But I mean, frankly, for most faculty members at a big research university, increasingly it is the case that teaching is not the priority. Um, I think at Concordia it remains a priority, but there are few newly minted PhDs at a big research university who will devote most of their time to teaching. It's just
Right.
not where the incentive structure suggests that we spend our time, and that is perhaps unfortunate. But it's don't hate the player, hate the game. This is the institutional structure that we operate in. The key to success, to advancement, to tenure is seldom. Um, through teaching. Now, Concordia, to its credit, does still very much value teaching, and you can focus on teaching when you apply for promotion from associate to full professor. And that's wonderful. And increasingly, I think that's rare at the level of a big research university. And I mean, further to Concordia's credit in this regard, last time I checked, there are relatively few courses here that are over 100 students, whereas at the other English institution across town, which shall remain nameless, but you know what it is, there are relatively few courses that are under 100. And I mean, I think class size matters hugely. And Concordia, to its credit, has a lot of non huge classes. So what I'm trying to say is Concordia, I think, is unusual as a big research university in giving more than lip service to the importance of education. I think it's a vestige of the founding institutions of Concordia, the two of them, that Concordia still does place this value on education, again, unusual for a big research university. But having said that, for many faculty members, it's not the priority. It is still something that matters. And I think that it's a way that we can have an impact. And many professors want to have an impact. They want to write books, articles, publications that will be noticed by people across their discipline. They want to have an impact intellectually in that respect. But another way to have impact is over the course of a career, the thousands of students that you interact with in your courses. So I do think that teaching matters not just for the university, but from the standpoint of a faculty member who wants to have an impact. So how to do better at it? Try, care, realize that it's not an afterthought, but it's an essential aspect of our job. I mean, we're not being paid to focus on teaching 9 to 5, but a good chunk of that time, at least, it does still matter. So it deserves our attention, and caring about it is the place to start. And sadly, not everybody does, again, because that's just not where the incentives drive faculty members. Beyond that, I think it depends on your discipline. It varies greatly. I mean, if you're teaching intro biology, if you're teaching theology, I imagine, or political science of one sort or another. So it just varies. And I found that when I was doing these teaching workshops, it was hard to give sort of blanket advice because was so different across disciplines. If you're in fine arts and you're in business, it's just a different sort of experience. It also depends not just on the subject matter, but the size of the course. Is this 100 students in a 200 level survey introductory course? Or is it 5 students in a graduate seminar? In other words, the size, the level of the class matters, the disciplinary differences matter. But aside from just caring, I mean, the one sort of trick most teachers I think know is trying to get students to participate is often difficult. Some people say it's worse post-pandemic. Perhaps, I'm not sure. But it can often be difficult. You want to have students engage. Again, small courses give them the opportunity to engage. They should take advantage of that opportunity. They should talk. And I think it's kind of a two-way street. I tell students that they need to come prepared to talk, and I need to come prepared to bring them out. And hopefully we meet in the middle and good things happen. But it can be hard. So I think giving students the encouragement to engage, inviting them to engage, sort of trying your best to pull them out and get them involved. One little trick is when you ask a question and no one answers, let the silence hang there for 10 seconds until they say, oh my God, we're going to have to say something. This guy's not going to say anything. And that's a little trick. But there are others, I think, get it back to politics. I say, look, it's not my mission here to tell you what to think. If you are a closet conservative and you're very lonely here in liberal Concordia, Quebec, you can talk. It's okay. It's all right. You can have the courage to stand up and you'll be accepted. And some of them appreciate that. So I shouldn't have to say that, but I do. And I think it's helpful.
A lot of profs may have the fear of backlash from opening the door for folks that are mildly and respectfully conservative to actually speak because of, the actions that are the stuff that's going on. Just the fact that there have been a lot of, going back to the point of folks giving their talks, their conferences, or whatever, getting assaulted verbally or physically, and I think a lot of professors may be reticent to, open that Pandora's box.
They might, and in some disciplines it's not necessary. But I mean, I teach politics, so it's sort
Right.
of hard to avoid some of these things. And I think it's fine to talk about this. I mean, for God's sakes, this is Quebec. We're used to serious differences. It's part of our daily lived experience. English, French, Federalist, Nationalist. I
Yeah.
mean, people are divided, relationships are divided, families are divided over these issues. We all know people, we should all know people who see the world very differently, and we should still be able to interact with them in a good way. And I think that when students hear this, they can say, my friend over here has a point of view that I don't share, but good on him. I'm not going to stand in his way.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't regret paying almost $3,000 for that Harvard Bach education, higher education course, because I did learn a lot about how to write a teaching philosophy statement and understanding the importance of a teaching portfolio. And now I was already enrolled in Concordia's C Teach graduate seminar, graduate micro diploma, micro program. But again, like I had to wait till next winter to take the to continue on in the program. So I figured I'll pay the $2,600 and take the Harvard education course. And again, do I want the prestige of having the Harvard name on my resume? Absolutely. I'm a big fan of selling oneself. Not super selfishly, but just to promote yourself. I think that's very important. And a lot of the things that we learned were very fundamental to higher education teaching. And unfortunately, I think a lot of professors don't have any formal training. Some do, obviously, but a lot of them don't. When it comes to approaching adults, especially young adults that are, 19 to 25, still trying to figure it out and carve their path in life.
Sorry,
Yeah,
it's an excellent point. I mean, I've said that professors may or may not have much interest in being better teachers, but even insofar as they are interested, as you said, many don't have the training. It's just
yeah,
not part of a PhD's training to have extensive instruction in the art and science of education. And that sort of thing does matter. And frankly, faculty probably should have more of that, if not as part of the becoming credentialed as a PhD, then I think certainly before teaching. And again, to Concordia's credit, at least in years past, it has made some efforts to ensure that people who are being a TA for the first time go through a little bit of instruction. I
yeah.
think this used to be, I confess I'm on sabbatical and I don't know what the current state of these policies is, but I think it used to be voluntary and now it is pretty much obligatory. And I think that's probably for the best.
Well, as a TA myself, I have not received like an acceptance ritual type of training to know how to teach. That's not. I haven't received any rigid um, coaching as to how to approach students because most of my work is correcting exams or papers, which is okay for now. But I have been learning the ropes a lot with a tutoring job that I have on the side as an autonomous worker, and I'm close to like 400 hours, and I got hired back in July 2022. So in under a year, I've picked up a lot of skills as to how to approach kids that are in second grade, like adults. One guy who's like 23 years old in CEGEP, right? So going through that broad range of different, um, you know, age groups from kids to adolescents and adults, and having that practical experience, I think is just as important um, as receiving a rigid theoretical training like the one I took with Harvard. And right now I just got hired at ELC College to teach English and French, which is pretty cool. To me, just for me to start, learning what it is from a practical point of view, getting my hands dirty with what exactly teaching is and how to approach different things. Just yesterday, I mean, just asking people to shut down their phones and not text during class, just these disciplinary cues are very important because from a pedagogical and educational point of view, we need to narrow people's focus um, toward the actual course content, and having that proper marriage of teaching and learning and understanding the differences and how they have to be in sync are super important. So yeah, I mean, the teaching profession is definitely a noble profession, and that's not even coming from me. It's somebody who told me that teaching is something that's noble because that the impact that teachers have on someone's life, especially back in high school, when they're in their formative years, is super important. And I think that's just as important as the um, load of content that's being transmitted educationally and
Agreed, agreed. I'm
kind of
reminded
yeah.
I had a guy come to my house a couple of years ago to see about redoing some of the old windows, and he had gone to Concordia decades ago, and he said, Graham, realize the power you have and be careful with it, but you can really have an impact, and the things you say will stick with at least some students
Right.
for some time. And I thought that was kind of a nice thing to say.
And they have you had students like contacting you years afterwards say,
I
hey,
have, and that's
yeah,
nice, and I enjoy that, as everybody does, I'm sure.
it's pretty
Yeah,
cool,
yeah,
right? To see that,
yeah,
somebody remembers you like 4 years down the line, and
absolutely.
that's great. I mean, one final question before we wrap this thing up is, I asked the same thing to Dr. Eric Musetti, um, pertaining to like final thoughts. What would be like your final thoughts that you'd like to share on a podcast that is in and of itself academic, but also open to a wider audience? What if it can be related to politics, teaching, theology, or anything that you'd like to share?
Boy, that's an open-ended question that
Yeah,
I was
pretty open.
utterly unprepared for here. I don't know. I mean, we've covered a lot of different things: American politics, teaching, etc. Is there? I mean, I thought we were going to talk about political apologies, to be honest with you. So this is something that I was prepared to go on a great
Sorry,
length about that we
political
did
what? Sorry.
not. Political apologies, which is an area
Okay.
that I work in, where the study of government, political, state official apologies for wrongs done, and there are not a lot of examples of this, frankly, in the United States, but in Canada there are an awful lot, and this is something I think people should be attentive to. This sort of many of the great historical wrongs have been apologized for in some fashion or other, and whether those are effective or not is for I guess the victims and their families to decide, not for me. But it is something that I continue to dabble in going forward, and we've seen some of this from the Catholic Church with regards to residential schools here in Canada. We've seen some from Canada with regard to, again, residential schools and related issues. But this is a sort of phenomenon that is always at the periphery of my own engagement, and it's something that I think we'll continue to see. And there's a politics to it. I mean, people on the right often say that, no, there's nothing to apologize for here. It's intergenerational guilt. It was a long time ago. Get over it. Just move on.
Yeah.
But clearly, for many of the victims and their families, they think that these things should be apologized for, if not compensated for. So this is a topic I would flag for people's attention going forward.
I mean, yeah. I mean, if you want to, if you'd like to delve into that furthermore, because perhaps it kind of flew under my nose, or I'm not sure, but yeah. I mean, we could have an opening about political theology and what people should expect, pertaining to your work or pertaining to the whole field of political science on that particular in that particular vein.
There is a sort of connection there. I mean, the apologies in governmental public political life are similar to apologies in people's private lives. You have occasion to apologize to family members, neighbors, colleagues for whatever. Um, but a lot of these things do have an analogy, if not a root, in the various religious traditions. I mean, in Roman Catholicism, obviously, confession; in Judaism, the Day of Atonement. But there are any number of these sort of analogs, and the idea is just as in those religious apologies, there's usually an admonition to separate the sin from the sinner. Similarly, in personal life, and I think in public life, this idea that, look, what was done was wrong, but you can atone for it and be forgiven for it, and emerge perhaps a better person for it. And I think these things often do have strong. I don't know if I want to say religious overtones, but I think the analogy to various traditions, religious traditions, is strong.
Wonderful, that's great, and you know. We never know. Perhaps we can delve into this in the future if that's possible. If that's something you'd like to do. So yeah. On that note, I really had a lot of fun today.
Great.
Just reigniting the podcast a month after it was kind of dormant, for me to take a break. And there might be other people that would like to, be the hosts because we have quite the gang, 4 or 5 people who would like to host the podcast, and hopefully we can have like a roundtable discussion in the future. So that's it, guys. Thank you very much for listening. This was Dr. Graham Dodds. So we were going back and forth on email just to make this thing happen, and I'm glad that we delved once again into politics, just like I did with Dr. Filani and Dr. Buzetti in the past. And I'm looking forward to having more guests, especially from poli sci or whether it be theology or religion or all of these different humanities disciplines. And, just to lift one more point here, when I do give these presentations to SAGEPs to encourage people to enroll into theology, that was part of my contract a couple of months ago. I do emphasize on the connections that exist between theology and the related disciplines, that being political science, religion, history, anthropology, sociology, and even psychology. So thank you guys for listening, and stay tuned for the next one.